Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Anti-Doping Podcast, brought to you by the Partnership for Clean Competition. I'm your host, Dr. Marie McNeely, and today we are joined by our guest, Dr. Naomi Spears. Listeners, Naomi is the former Chief Science Officer and current General Manager of Operations at Sport Integrity Australia. In our interview today, we are going to talk more about Sport Integrity Australia, their anti-doping program, and how they are working with others around the world to protect clean sport. So, Naomi, welcome to the show today. How are you?
I'm very well. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. Maybe to start, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself, Naomi, and your role at Sport Integrity Australia?
As you said, I'm the Chief Science Officer at Sport Integrity Australia. It's a role that I love, a great opportunity to use science and medicine in a whole range of different areas. So I see the primary role of my team as being interpreters, helping the rest of our organisation understand the really complex science and medicine that exists in anti-doping and helping them to use that in their anti-doping roles. So whether that's with our comms and media team, our education team, through intelligence testing, legal and investigations.
I love that, thinking about it as the role of interpreter. So you can hear your passion coming through, Naomi. How did you originally become interested in anti-doping, and maybe how did you find your way to this particular position?
So when I finished high school, I was really keen to do something in science, not sure exactly what that would be. And as I looked through the university courses available in Sydney, where I lived, a forensic science course stood out to me. So I studied that at university and then did a PhD in that area. And then I worked with the Australian Federal Police in their forensic services for about 13 years in the chemical analysis team. And then I was looking for a new opportunity which would use the skills and experience that I had. And at the time, ASADA, the Australian Sports Anti-Doping Authority, advertised a role as their head of science. And I jumped at that opportunity because I could see that the skills and experience that I had in forensic chemistry would be really applicable to the anti-doping world.
And now for listeners who aren't familiar with the organization, what is Sport Integrity Australia's mission and how is it organized?
Yeah, so our vision is for there to be safe and fair sport for all. So we're working to have a positive impact on sport in Australia and protecting the Australian community who are heavily invested in sport. Australia is a sport-mad country. There is more media and public interest in sport than anything else, and a really high percentage of our population are also actively involved in community sport. So we're bringing people together and providing support, advice and resources to identify the threats to sport integrity and across a broad range of threats, and then working with sports to address those threats.
Oh, very cool. And can you expand maybe a little on how the organization is organized and how it is operating?
We have a couple of different streams. So within the operations area, which is where I work, we have the science and medicine functions, anti-doping testing, intelligence and investigations, and an information coordination centre. And where our section is really operational, as the name implies, a lot of the anti-doping testing and investigations run out of our section, and all the information about potential integrity threats comes into our section for the initial bit of work. We've also got a sport partnership section. So they're really at the front face assisting Australian sports. So in there, we've got our sport partnership team. We've got our education area. We've got our safeguarding team. And they're working together with Australian sport to be proactive and preventing threats to Australian sport. Then we've got our corporate side who make the business run for the rest of us. So IT, HR, finance, all those things that we couldn't do our work without. And then we have an international and strategy division. So within there is our anti-doping policy team, competition manipulation team, major event support and strategic intelligence.
Oh, very interesting. And I understand there was some reorganization within the Australia anti-doping community relatively recently. So Sport Integrity Australia was actually formed a few years ago to combine multiple related organizations within Australia that had operated separately before that. So Naomi, can you tell us a little bit more about the history that really led up to the establishment of Sport Integrity Australia as it is now and why it was formed?
Definitely. So back in 2018, the Australian government requested a review of the sports integrity arrangements in Australia. How was sport integrity managed across the country and different sports, to consider how that could best be done in Australia? So the review examined key Australian and international threats to the integrity of sport, how they were managed and what could change going into the future. And one of the recommendations from that review was that the Australian government establish a single organisation to draw together the existing sport integrity capabilities, knowledge and expertise, and to nationally coordinate across those threats. So the way that it works in Australia, that review was conducted, then the Australian government consider that review and decide which of the recommendations they will carry out. And that recommendation that there be a single agency was supported by the government. And so on the 1st of July 2020, Sport Integrity Australia commenced operations and brought together the roles that were in ASADA, our National Anti-Doping Agency, some functions that were in our Department of Health and some functions that were in our Sports Commission, and brings them all together within Sport Integrity Australia.
That's wonderful. I know 2020 was a tumultuous year for many people, so it's good to hear that something good came out of it.
It certainly was. We started in the midst of COVID restrictions with a new office that no one could attend. It was a really difficult time to bring together different functions.
Absolutely. So what have been then some of the benefits, Naomi, that you've experienced from combining these integrity and anti-doping efforts under Sport Integrity Australia?
So there's a few different ones that I'll highlight. I think the first is for national sporting organisations in Australia. They now have a single point for all of their sport integrity concerns. So previously they would have to know, should I speak to ASADA about that, or should I speak to the Department of Health about that, or should I speak to the Australian Sports Commission about that? Now they've got one place and everything comes to us, and then we can guide that inquiry within the organisation to the right area, or even if it's outside our remit, we can guide sports to what other government agencies they might need to speak to. The second is that some of these threats are potentially linked together. So something like an athlete has used illicit drugs, and then that illicit drug use is used to blackmail them into a match fixing situation. So bringing those threats together and having the whole picture is really important to help sports have the best impact. And it also means that we can work with sports to prioritise the threat in their sport. So for some sports, it might be that child safeguarding is the major risk, and we're advising them to put a lot of resources into that. Where another sport, the major risk might be doping, and they need to be putting their resources into that. So we're able to work with sports to prioritise for them specifically which of the integrity threats we think they should be investing in at this point in time.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. And Naomi, we're particularly interested, of course, in the anti-doping programs here at the PCC. So I'd love to dig into those into a little bit more detail. So Naomi, can you tell us about the different components of Sport Integrity Australia's anti-doping programs?
Yeah, there's so many different components, and that's why I love working in anti-doping as a scientist, is that I get to be involved with all these different aspects. So to start from the prevention end, we have a great education and comms team who are constantly developing new resources and online courses and face-to-face sessions with athletes and support people. There's a parents course, a coaches course, a medical practitioners course, giving everyone in sport the tools to be aware of what their obligations are, to be aware of the risks to them and their athletes in terms of their health, and giving them the tools to comply, because that's what most people want to do. So that's our primary focus, is to give people an understanding and ability to protect themselves. Then, of course, we've got our intelligence and testing teams and my science and medicine team, and those three sections work really closely together. Intelligence are receiving information, whether that's in the form of tip-offs or information from our partners, and assessing that information and considering what are the genuine threats to sport. The science team are providing information about different substances and how they might be used, when they would be used. And we're all working really closely with our testing team to prioritise within our testing program what sports, what athletes, when we're testing. Like all ADOs, we're aiming to test the right athlete at the right time with the right test. And then when things go wrong, for athletes, they make unwise choices or they're purposefully doping, then there's our investigations and legal team. So they're working on AAF's analytical ADRVs, but also non-analytical matters as well, and bringing together all that information and evidence and determining whether there are violations that have occurred or not. And another key part is our sport partnerships team. So they're the front face for national sporting organisations within Australia, and they're helping those national sporting organisations to understand what we can offer to the sports in terms of education, to make sure that those organisations understand their requirements in terms of mandating education or having their athletes comply with whereabouts, and also understanding our testing program and why we are or aren't doing a lot of testing in particular sports.
Very interesting. Well, it sounds like, Naomi, you have an excellent and comprehensive anti-doping program there. And I really like the point that you made in talking about the education, that you don't just target athletes. You create materials and resources for doctors, coaches, families, these other stakeholders in sport as well. And I love this section of your team that you've developed, the sport partnerships team, that can really focus on interfacing with the community. I think that's huge as well.
Absolutely. Like, it's so important to be working in the whole space of sport. Athletes don't operate in a vacuum. They're influenced by and supported by so many people around them. So we want to be working with all of those people. As we have capability, obviously we have to prioritise what we can and can't do at different points in time. But we want everyone to be working together to that one goal of safe and fair sport in Australia.
Absolutely. And thinking about your anti-doping organization compared to maybe others around the world, is there anything in particular that really comes to mind, Naomi, that you think makes Sport Integrity Australia unique, or something that the organization really does particularly well?
One thing that I really value about our organisation is the collaboration and partnerships, both internally and externally. So as I was saying, internally, like, one of my great joys of this role is working with everyone in the organisation and my team being able to support and have a hand in so many different things, whether that's working with our media team and helping them understand the science or medicine and how they might explain that to the general public, through to sitting in a tribunal hearing with our legal team and making sure that the experts that we're using are well suited and well qualified to provide the advice that we need. But also externally, like, we have great partnerships internationally and domestically with other partners in anti-doping, because we fully recognise that we cannot do this on our own. There's pieces of the landscape that we don't have any control over, and we need to work with our partners. And there's information and experience that our partners have that we want to learn from and share with them our experiences and learnings as well.
Absolutely. I think these partnerships are so key in anti-doping, and you find that in a lot of these cases, many different organizations are battling the same issues and trying to find innovative solutions. And I think this is where anti-doping science really shines in some of the new innovations that are coming out. So thinking about the scientific side, Naomi, what are your current scientific priorities there at Sport Integrity Australia?
So I'll touch on two things that we've been working on lately. The first is the implementation of dry blood spot into our testing program. So just in March this year, we did our first dry blood spot collection, and they're growing quite quickly as our field staff become more familiar with the process. And that was a great collaboration between ourselves, Drug Free Sport New Zealand, and the Australian Sports Drug Testing Laboratory, who are our WADA accredited laboratory in Australia. And so the three of us worked together. Drug Free Sport were ahead of us in this process, and so we could really learn from their experiences in collecting tests and coordinating the shipping and all of those things. We learned a lot from their experience, and we worked together with the WADA lab in Sydney to decide what analyses Drug Free Sport and us would want to prioritise the lab to validate, and working together to build that capability collectively. The second one is we've been working with the University of Queensland and again ASDTL in looking at wastewater analysis and how that could be useful to us in the anti-doping process. So we've had a PhD student who finished the end of last year, and she essentially did a proof of concept about could wastewater analysis be valuable in detecting PEDs, and we looked primarily at the anabolic agents, so steroids and SARMs and a couple of others, and she validated a method to do that in wastewater. And then we've done a little survey of Australia with some really intriguing results. So she was able to do a temporal study. So the University of Queensland have samples going back 10 years, and doing this retrospective study, we're able to see when and how SARMs emerged for use in the community in Australia. And then she's done a survey in 2021 in a particular week, which was the Census Week in Australia, looking across over 50 wastewater sites, which cover over 50% of the Australian population, and is analysing whether SARMs are present and other anabolic agents in those locations. And scarily, she found them, I think in all but 2 sites, had some performance enhancing drugs in their wastewater samples.
That is remarkable. And what's, I think, particularly amazing to me is when you're taking SARMs, oftentimes you're trying to detect such a tiny amount in blood, for example, but in wastewater, that's a whole lot more dilution that we're talking about. So what was it like, I guess, developing the methods and trying to design that study to detect what could be very, very tiny amounts?
Yeah, so I had the easy job of not being in the lab, just providing advice. Katja, who was our PhD student, did that hard work. And look, we really relied on the experience of the University of Queensland, who have been doing wastewater analysis for other substances for a long time, and our colleagues at the Australian Sports Drug Testing Laboratory, who have all that expertise in anti-doping testing. So they did the hard work of method validation. But when we put forward the proposal, I think each partner thought, this isn't going to work, but let's give it a try. And I remember the first time that Katja found one thing in one sample, and we were all like, whoa, this worked. To see those results across time and across Australia is well beyond what any of us expected.
Oh, absolutely. Well, it sounds like a really exciting research project and a promising area to get that temporal view of how these trends in doping substances and performance-enhancing drugs might be changing in Australia over time and maybe even regionally within Australia. And I know over the last 15 years, the PCC itself has funded actually quite a few different research projects with organizations in Australia. So, Naomi, can you tell us a little bit more about how Sport Integrity Australia works with either these organizations, such as the National Measurement Institute or these other universities, to benefit from the research that the PCC is funding?
Absolutely. As I look down the list of the projects that the PCC have funded in Australia, I see lots of our key partners there. So we've already spoken about the Australian Sports Drug Testing Laboratory, and they sit within the National Measurement Institute, NMI. And I know that PCC have funded work at NMI, like in relation to reference materials. And that's really important to us. If we don't have high quality reference materials in the anti-doping labs, then we can't have that confidence in the results, and we can't always get the results that we're looking for. So we work really closely with NMI on a whole range of different things. I also see Dr. Laura Lewis, one of the PCC fellows. We had the privilege of working with Laura on some research projects while she was in Australia, in particular some work on plasma volume for the blood passport and some work that she was doing at Tour Down Under, which is an Australian cycling event. I see Professor David Handelsman, who's another key partner of ours, the University of Queensland, who were involved in that wastewater project. So many Australian collaborators of ours are also partners with the PCC.
That is phenomenal. I think those partnerships, like we mentioned previously, can be key to advancing anti-doping. And we also mentioned earlier that Sport Integrity Australia has a lot of these wonderful international partnerships and is highly engaged in anti-doping efforts globally. So can you tell us, Naomi, a little bit more about some of these collaborations and interactions with international stakeholders?
Yeah, so there's so many. So I'll touch on a few different groups. The first is we're working with other NADOs. These partners are in the same space as us, often has the same challenges as us, as you already mentioned. So we're keen to share with them our experience and learn from theirs. In particular, we work really closely with Drug Free Sport New Zealand. Australia and New Zealand have this kind of family relationship. We call them our cousins across the ditch, that the country who we have intense sporting rivalry with, but actually we work really closely in so many areas, including anti-doping. So probably everyone in our organisation knows their partner within Drug Free Sport New Zealand. Similarly, we work really closely with CARDA, the Korean Anti-Doping Agency. So in the science space, my team meet weekly with the CARDA scientist, the Drug Free Sport New Zealand scientist, and some of the staff from the Australian Sports Drug Testing Laboratory. And they talk collectively about athlete biological passports, who's seeing different things, how people have approached a similar situation in the past. And every organisation and person brings different skills and knowledge. And collectively, we're much stronger than just my science team looking on their own or the drug-free sport scientist looking on his own. Together, we share those experiences and qualifications. We also work really closely with ORADO. So they're the Oceania Regional Anti-Doping Organisation. And one of our focuses is building capability in other partners, primarily in our neighbourhood, so the Pacific and Asia. We also work really closely with international sporting federations. Obviously, we often have a joint interest in a high-performing Australian athlete. So we work really closely with organisations like the Athletics Integrity Unit, the International Testing Agency, to coordinate our testing programs for those athletes, for us to learn from their experience because they know their particular sport better than we do, but also to share the Australian context with them because we know our country better than they do. So together, we're much stronger. And then we also have the privilege of working with Australian experts who sit on a number of WADA committees, particularly in the science and medicine space. So we have Professor Andrew McLaughlin, who sits on the Health Medicine and Research Committee, Dr. David Handelsman, who sits on the Prohibited List Expert Group, Dr. Susan White, who's the chair of the TUE Committee, Professor Ken Ho, who sits on the Growth Hormone Working Group, Dr. Lance Brooker, who sits on the Steroid Passport Working Group, and I sit on the Lab Expert Working Group. Obviously, there's confidentiality arrangements about what we can share with each other, about what's discussed in those committees. But where there's a topic or an issue of mutual interest, then we're absolutely working together to see what kind of solutions we can bring forward to the anti-doping community. And Australia has a long history of really being a prominent partner in the anti-doping space, and we're proud to continue that.
Absolutely. And that was a perfect segue, I think, Naomi. So you mentioned you're part of this WADA Laboratory Expert Advisory Group. So can you tell us more about the purpose and the importance of this group?
So the role of the Lab Expert Group is the overall management of the accreditation and re-accreditation, if required, of anti-doping labs, and also the maintenance of the international standard for laboratories. So that's the 150-page document that guides how the anti-doping labs need to operate, and the associated technical documents. And the technical documents provide the detail about specific types of testing and how they need to be carried out in anti-doping analysis.
Oh, very interesting. And then what are your specific responsibilities as a member of this group, or how does it work being part of it?
The group has 3 meetings a year. So 2 of them are face-to-face and one's virtual. We've got a virtual one coming up soon. And in those meetings, we'll discuss issues that might have arisen in a particular laboratory and how that laboratory could be supported to correct an issue if it's occurred. We'll discuss potential changes to technical documents, the operation of the ECAS, the External Quality Assurance System, which is a really important part of the accreditation of WADA labs. Those kind of issues we'll discuss together. And outside of meetings, there's a lot of circulation of papers about a particular issue, and each member of the committee will give their thoughts and different perspectives. So I'm privileged to bring in the perspective of anti-doping organisations to that committee to consider, like, how will a planned change impact on the anti-doping organisations once they receive the result from the laboratory? Is there any ways that we could potentially modify things to make that a smoother process for anti-doping organisations? And then also to consider, well, what are the ways that anti-doping organisations could be helping our partners in the laboratories, and how can we better work together?
Well, it sounds like you have a lot of opportunities to work with experts in anti-doping from around the world, which I think is so important to have those conversations, to be making those connections, because sport is international in so many different ways. So let's talk a little bit about some of the international sport that Sport Integrity Australia has been a part of. You were actually a member of the anti-doping task force for the 2022 Commonwealth Games in Birmingham. So Naomi, can you tell us a little bit more about the role that the organization played in this task force?
Yeah, so the anti-doping task force for Birmingham was similar to those that were run for the 2018 Commonwealth Games on the Gold Coast, and that are run like before the Olympics and the Paralympics. And our role in that one was to share our experience and expertise. So our director of anti-doping testing sat on that task force, and also had the opportunity to learn from other anti-doping agencies and how they were delivering their pre-games programs. Similar to the Olympic and the Paralympic programs, the task force delivered to ADO's recommendations about testing they would like to see done before the Games to strengthen the anti-doping program at the Games. So we're really keen to contribute to there being an internationally level playing field. A common concern that we hear from Australian athletes is that the Australian program is so strong, and they say, but what about my international competitors? Are they subject to the same level of scrutiny that we are? And so we really want to work with our international partners to make that international playing field as level as it can be.
Absolutely. I think that is critically important, and interesting to hear that you're getting that feedback regularly from athletes. And I think Australia has actually been in the spotlight for contributions to anti-doping testing and retesting efforts for major sporting events such as the Commonwealth Games. So Naomi, can you tell us a little bit more about how this retesting and long-term storage process works for you there?
So one of the great advantages that we have under the World Anti-Doping Code is that samples from athletes can be stored up to 10 years, and then we can reanalyze them at any point within that period. So it might be that we get more information about a particular athlete, and we think, oh, we should go back and have a closer look at that athlete. It might be as technology improves detection limits or methods are changed within the laboratories, or we have more information. So we're talking about the emergence before of SARMs. Sometimes the labs don't know about those substances until after they're already being used by athletes. But with the stored samples, we can go back and, when the labs do have that capability, reanalyze for those substances. So for the 2018 Commonwealth Games, we worked closely with CGF to ensure that all of the samples collected at the Games went into long-term storage. And similarly, we have our own program of putting samples into long-term storage as we collect them, and then on an annual basis going back and reanalyzing samples, whether that's on the basis of new technology, new methods, or new information, as I said. And also when we're particularly concerned about an individual athlete, then what samples of that athlete we have in long-term storage and what reanalysis might be useful is a key consideration for us.
Very interesting. And from a logistics perspective, I guess, where are long-term stored samples stored? And I guess, is there a limit to that capacity? Do you have to sort of make decisions about what samples are worth keeping, or can you keep them all?
So our samples are primarily stored at the Australian Sports Drug Testing Laboratory in Sydney. So we have an arrangement with them that they will store our samples. And yeah, there is a limit because the labs have a physical space. They can't continually grow. They can't continually put more freezers in. So we do have to make decisions. We don't store long-term every sample that we collect. The same as we're choosing which athletes to test in the first place, we're also choosing based on risk which samples will go into long-term storage. And then again, later down the track, we're deciding based on risk which samples we'll reanalyze.
Very interesting. And why is it so important, thinking big picture here, Naomi, to be keeping these samples for future analysis?
I think there's two really important reasons. The first is, as we've already said, scientific ability and knowledge changes. So as we learn more, then we're able to go back to samples and reanalyze. And we've seen that most dramatically in the reanalysis of samples from the Olympics and long-term metabolites that weren't known about at the time the testing was done have identified, sadly, a significant number of athletes who were doping but not detected at the time. The second, I think, is that it has a significant deterrent effect. So we openly say to athletes, if you're doping, you have to not only be able to avoid detection now, you have to be able to avoid detection for the next 10 years. And scientific technology and methods and information are continually changing. So are you sure that you'll be able to avoid detection for the next 10 years? Because we might have your sample that long.
Absolutely. And I think the possibilities of continued innovation and advancement of the science is one of the things that really makes working in anti-doping even more exciting. So I know oftentimes resources, little things like time, funding, feasibility, these sorts of things, Naomi, can hold you back.
Small things.
Small things, right? Details, really. So if you had all of the resources you could possibly dream up, what is the one problem in anti-doping that you would want to solve most?
The thing I would want to solve most is inadvertent doping. Now, I think strict liability is really an important part of the World Anti-Doping Code, but it makes me and our organisation really sad when we see athletes doping inadvertently. And so I would be putting those resources into, first of all, how can we prevent it? That's the best thing. So we've done a lot of work in the supplement space, working with our fellow regulators in Australia and our education team to help Australian athletes not inadvertently dope through supplement use. And we're so encouraged by the results that we've seen in that space. But I'd also love to see, and there is work happening, but more work happening that enables us to differentiate between inadvertent doping and purposeful doping. Now, in those circumstances, the violation still remains, and I think that's appropriate, but then we can consider sanction and what the appropriate consequences are for an athlete who inadvertently doped as compared to someone who was purposefully doping.
Absolutely. I think these are huge questions. And I think there's both limitations from the technology side as well as just from the general having enough resources to be able to do enough of the testing.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for dreaming big with us, Naomi. And I know we covered a lot of ground in our conversation today, but if our listeners are curious and they want to learn even more about you and the wonderful work that's being done at Sport Integrity Australia, what is the best way for them to do so?
So given this is a podcast, I'm imagining that the listeners are podcast people.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a podcast too. It's called Onside. And if you go to the Sport Integrity Australia website or to any podcast app, Spotify, whatever, and search up Onside, you'll find the Sport Integrity Australia podcast. There's some in there that feature me, but you can also see the whole range of areas that Sport Integrity Australia are working in. You'll hear from different sports people, athletes, sport administrators and their perspectives on sport integrity. If you want a base for everything, try the Sport Integrity Australia website and in particular the resources page, and you'll get links to the podcast, as I said, but also you can access our online learning, which is open and available to anyone who's interested. You just have to simply create a free account and then you can access the various courses. And of course, you can follow us on social media. I'm not a social media person, but we have a great social media team. And I think across all the major platforms, you'll find the presence of Sport Integrity Australia.
Fantastic. Well, listeners, definitely check out that website, get subscribed to their podcast Onside, and follow them on social media, get connected. And Naomi, it's been such a pleasure to have you on the show today. Thank you so much for your time.
It's been my pleasure to speak with you, Marie. Thank you.
Well, thanks again. And listeners, wonderful to have you here with us as well. If you haven't already, it would be fantastic if you could subscribe to our podcast and leave a review on your favorite platform. And listeners, please note that the Anti-Doping Podcast features a wide variety of clean sport experts, and episodes may include statements and or viewpoints that do not necessarily reflect the views or values of the PCC. Thank you, and we look forward to seeing you on the next episode of the Anti-Doping Podcast.